Hi, everyone, and welcome to this conversation between Jo Mitchell and Brian Killip. We're excited to be hosting this series through our Senior Center Without Walls program. Just before we begin, there's a few housekeeping items. This event's being recorded and we'll be posting it on our YouTube channel, Metchosin Seniors. And we ask that you keep your microphone muted for the first part of the talk, and then later up we'll open it up to questions and sharing. Helen Fletcher is here with me today, and she's the Vice President of the Metchosin Seniors Association, and she's going to introduce our guest today. So over to you, Helen.
Hello and welcome to our event. A viewer of one of our earlier...
half of Helen.
Oh, good point. Thank you. We're only seeing half.
Oh, okay. The whole is better. A viewer of one of our earlier programs in this series, Senior Center Without Walls, suggested we interview someone who was on Metchosin's first council. That first council meeting was in December 1984, 37 years ago. And Brian Killip was a founding member of the first council and served on it until 1990. And who better to interview him than longtime council member Jo Mitchell, who served from 2006 until 2014. We are so happy that they both accepted to participate in this program. Thank you, Brian and Jo.
Over to you.
Oh, it's for you.
Well, thank you very much for asking me to talk about this. It's a long time ago, and for us old folks, it's hard to remember that 37 years ago. But I must admit, it was quite an experience.
Yeah.
As you know, Jo, with the council. I don't know what people would like to know, but perhaps some thoughts about what prompted the incorporation.
This is very interesting. Yeah.
Back in 1981-82, there was, first of all, for people in Metchosin, I think there was some disillusionment with the CRD. As you probably know, that we only had one director, one vote. So during the 70s, Mac Tipton had been our CRD director. And then in the 80s, Shirley Wild took over. And each of them could only vote on land use issues once, where there were 7 or 8 other directors from unorganized areas, plus from the city of Victoria, Oak Bay. So Metchosin's position was really quite minor, and other people could decide on land use in Metchosin. And I think that caused people some concern back then. And also, of course, in 1983, what happened was that there was a discussion about amalgamation of Colwood, Langford, and Metchosin. And I think that prompted people in Metchosin to begin to think a great deal about the difference between urban and rural, realizing that folks in Colwood and Langford certainly were much more interested in an urban lifestyle, while we were interested in a more rural lifestyle. And that prompted us to say, look, we should talk about incorporation. Now, when we talked about incorporation, it hadn't been well accepted in the late 70s and early 80s, really around 1980. People here didn't seem terribly excited about the idea, but the amalgamation issue really acted as a catalyst to get people to come together. And that's when well, Shirley Wild, as the director of the time, she formed what was referred to as an incorporation task force, which was 10 or 11 residents, to sort of go over what would be necessary to incorporate and what would the implications be financially, and the legal implications of it. And of course, as I think I mentioned to you, that we were very fortunate because in Metchosin, we happened to have a resident lawyer who volunteered to give us a hand, his name was Scott Wilson. He was a sheep farmer down on William Head Road. And he was the foremost legal expert at the time in municipal law in the province. So we were very lucky to have him. Yeah. So this group worked on that. And then we presented the ideas to the people, and then there was a vote.
And I gather that if in fact the Metchosin hadn't come forward with ideas, we might have just, the province might have automatically lumped us in with Colwood and Langford, and we would have had to go along with the city outlook that they had.
That was a feeling of the time that well, there was some politics in it, in that at that time, the government in power was not the same as our sitting MLA. They were in two different parties. And I think there was some sentiment that there'd be no hesitation on the part of the government if fiscally it made sense to them to try to amalgamate the three areas. So that was part of it. Fortunately, the minister of the time, Bill Ritchie, did say that he would not do that, not force it, that he would give people a chance to have a vote first, which was very positive. But the amalgamation issue was really the most important thing that made people in Metchosin again reconsider the idea of incorporation. Yeah.
Who were some of the people who were on the first committee who sort of
Well,
shaped it?
yeah, I'm not sure I can remember all of them, but some of the people who were very, very active. One was the gentleman by the name of Ted Stevens. Ted took the responsibility of doing all the analysis on road work. That was one of the biggest issues about incorporating that made us responsible for the maintenance and capital on the road. And we knew that the road's cost would be very high and have tax implications. So Ted looked after that. Of course, we had Galt Wilson, who was a solicitor at the time, who helped us. Paul Moss he was with the Times Colonist and a resident of Metchosin and very helpful to us. Reg Bickford was another person from Albert Head who was very interesting. And Shirley Wild, although she wasn't really a member of the committee because she was a regional director at the time, she did participate from time to time. I was on there with the group, and then there were a number of other residents, a total of about 10.
And Noel Pemberton Billings, she was on.
Oh yes, I'm sorry, I didn't mention her.
Yeah,
Of course,
yeah.
she was a very active member. Yes.
Yeah, but she was the one who I've heard a lot about that period. She spoke quite a bit about it.
Well,
Yeah.
prior to getting involved, as you know, she was on the school board for a number of years, and she had a very strong community attitude. So she was very concerned about amalgamation. No was, and when the first council was elected, she was a member of that council, and that was something that I know she was always relieved about. That we finally had some control over land use in Metchosin, and that we could sort of set our own tone to what we wanted for land use. Yeah, very much so.
And what was the direction that initially that people were, and was it always obvious that we would become a municipality, or was there a lot of doubt?
Well, no, it was not always. It was not obvious, I have to say. There are a lot of libertarians around in Metchosin, and the idea of another level of government was not something that really appealed to them. And we, as a committee, when we had meetings and spoke with the residents, there were a couple of things that we explained that it's quite conceivable it would cost them more. We did explain that that was a distinct possibility, but we also suggested that may be an expense that you have to incur to keep the rural lifestyle. But when talking about that, we had to convince them that it wasn't another level. It was indirectly another level of government, but it was a level of government that could give them some control over what happened locally. And that was probably the hardest part to sell to people. When we would have meetings, we had a couple of public meetings. And I always recall sitting in these meetings, and we were trying to explain things to people, and 200 and 300 people showing up. In the front row,
That's a lot.
and this, as you can appreciate, this didn't cause a great deal of excitement in the community. But it was always humorous is that you come to these meetings, in the front row, there was a group of people who were sitting there doing their knitting, and passing comments, and as we would say things, and I kept thinking of the gallows in the 1700s. It was very funny, but it was dynamic, it was active, it was a good discussion, and when we did have the vote, you know, we had over 60, it was about 65% were in favor,
Yeah.
which I thought was really great, and we must have had, I don't remember the exact, but I think about 75 to 80% turnout to vote.
Yeah.
So it was really a good representation of people's feelings at the time.
Yeah. No. And once you sort of became elected, had you set out what your goals were going to be, or did you then start feeling what was wanted?
Well, it was quite amusing. The answer to your question is, well, sort of.
Yeah.
Because I remember the very first council meeting, or not even a council, the meeting of the group of us, of the 5 council, the mayor and the 4 council members. We met in the fire hall. We used a shuffleboard to put out some paper. That for the shuffleboard table is where we put all our documents. And we had a gentleman from the Ministry of Municipal Affairs by the name of Gary Paget, who gave us some tips about what we would have to do. And you got to realize that those people who are currently members of council and later that followed us, I mean, they don't think about the fact you come to a meeting and you have bylaws, everything's done for you. We didn't have anything, and we had to decide how we were going to go about starting this. And we did have a bylaw in the sense that the CRD bylaws continued to exist when we were first incorporated. And then our role was to change or tailor the bylaws in ways that we thought would be better for Metchosin. But we still did have that, but we didn't have anything else in terms of a structure.
Yeah.
And so we met in the fire hall, and Gary helped us out a little bit about what we needed to do. And then the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Saanich got together, and they seconded a fellow by the name of Paul McKivitt, who worked for Saanich. And he came and acted as an interim clerk just to help us out until we had to do the advertising, to hire a clerk, and to hire one staff person to assist the clerk. And then we had to find a place to meet. And so there was a lot going on that detracted us from looking at things like land use bylaws and other things, because we really had to organize the municipality. And then we had to find a place to meet, which of course was, in the end, we renovated the top floor of the community hall. There's a room there. Yeah. And we turned that into a council chamber and office. And that had to do us for almost a year. But while doing that, we had sort of, Herman Vogt, who was the mayor, was really a very fine person to work with. Herman took the position of asking all the members of council, what kinds of things do you think you can do best for the municipality? And as a result of that, that's how we place people to do certain, for example, like Ted Stevens, who was elected. Ted made it clear that, look, I understand roads, I can do the roads.
And I gather this was incredibly important.
Oh, very important.
Yeah.
And Jeff Hadley, he was a quantity surveyor. So he had his own business. And then his job was to estimate large buildings, the costs. He was a real detail-oriented fellow. And he wanted to do the changes for the planning or the land use bylaw, and to put the OCP together for that, so it was Metchosin. So just a perfect kind of person who was really a stickler on details. It was just a great. And then Noel was really interested in the cultural things in the community, worried about recreation. She worried about the library and transportation, and she wanted to have some involvement in, at the time, the community center, or the idea of we could have a village and how would that evolve. And
of course, Metchosin didn't have a village center. Then.
We did not.
You had the store.
Well, we had the store, and that's it.
Yeah.
That's it. Literally, that's all that we had. You're right.
Yeah.
And then I looked after the finance and administration side, and then Herman was a CRD rep, and that's sort of how it evolved from there. And then in our first year, Ted and I on roads and money worked quite closely together, and we had a few surprises. When we did incorporate, we were guaranteed $190,000 a year from the provincial government for 5 years to cover the maintenance costs on the road. And we were also guaranteed that we have two types of roads in Metchosin at the time. We have what's called secondary highways, and then we have just the regular roads. The secondary highways, the ministry again said that they would look after the maintenance of them, and we would be responsible for the other 60% of the roads. But as we went through the numbers, it became very evident that there was a problem, that the Ministry of Highways, when they provided the data, they didn't give us all the data. And so when we did acquire, we realized that in the first 3 years of incorporation, that the 60% of roads that we were responsible for would almost about just over 50% were going to require serious capital work, very expensive work. And we were all because some roads hadn't been touched since 1945. And then the Highways Authority, up until incorporation, had been involved in approval of subdivisions and roads. And some of the roads were just chip seal and not in very good shape. So it became a real problem that we weren't aware of. And then one other thing occurred was that up until that point in British Columbia, any area that incorporated became a municipality, they were entitled to what was called, it was like a restructuring grant. It was referred to as incorporation grants. And part of it was a tax grant, and part of it was a grant to help you set up a municipal hall, public lands for road servicing. And we weren't given any of that. We were the first area to incorporate, and that we're not offered that. And we went back, Tumbler Ridge 2 years before us, Williams Lake, Vanderhoof both went through an extension. And so we sat down and said, this is not correct. And so Metchosin prepared a brief, and we went to the government and said, hey, look, Colwood at that point was thinking about incorporating. And we said, look, if you don't provide this transition grant, you're making life very difficult for our area and Colwood as well. And as a result, we managed to get they agreed with us. They said we should have taken care of this. And we ended up with about $1.3 million in grants. Plus we got another $1 million.
To last you over what period?
We got it in 3 years, over a 3-year period. Plus we got the $190,000 a year that we already negotiated. So that almost $1 million there. So we had 2.3 million, and then we got a couple of other grants, which allowed us at that point to be able to go out and make an offer on some land in the village center that we wanted to buy, and then set up what we call reserve funds. One of the things back then, interest rates were much higher back then than they are today. So after we managed to do what we needed to in terms of buying things, it was possible for us to set up reserve funds and earn interest on those, which helped to gain in terms of revenue to the district in addition to the taxes. And so that was how we sort of ran. The mentality was running the district. And I don't believe we ever went into debt, other than simply a transition between when taxes came in and when they went out. But we didn't go into debt.
And what is amazing is that here we are 35 odd years later, and we still have no debt.
That's right. That people have continued the idea of having the reserve funds and they draw on them as they need them, which is the way it should be. It worked really well. At the time, we also went a little bit further back then, because we didn't have a building inspector. And so we didn't have a roads crew. So we opted to hire people under contract. Our first building inspector, for example, was a local. He's an engineer, and he was paid by the different inspections that he did. And likewise for the road crew to do the maintenance, we hired a fellow who had a firm, Carl Irvin,
Mm.
and he provided the road service.
Mm.
And in fact, there was a sentiment on council that we would much prefer people who are building to have to hire their own engineer and certify it, so we didn't have to get into it.
Mm.
And today, you know, almost all inspections, the building inspector at some place says, well, I can't, you need to get an engineer to approve that. It was similar back then.
Mm.
And we just thought that that might make more sense and an easier way to administer the service.
Mm.
But that was sort of the mentality. Yeah.
Mm. Mm. Oh, so now, one thing that really I wondered about is, today we have the Muse. Anything we want to get out to people, we just put it in the Muse. How in those days did you contact people?
Well, we didn't have the internet.
I know you didn't have the internet either.
We didn't have social media, thank goodness.
Yeah.
What did happen was that we were covered, the local paper, the Gazette at the time, which of course is still here, but the Gazette would send reporters to all the meetings.
Oh, yeah.
It was quite different,
Yeah.
and Times colonists would occasionally, when they had a slow night, they send a reporter to Metchosin to the
Yeah.
council.
Yeah.
But that's generally speaking what happened.
Yeah.
And but mostly the Gulfstream Gazette.
Yeah.
They were very good at that. You know, George Manning and his
Yeah.
crew at the time went to a lot of trouble to send people out
Yeah.
to carry the local news.
Now, of those people who were opposed to becoming a municipality, what did they envisage Metchosin might have done?
Well,
To join with Colwood and Langford, or
I don't recall whether they gave an alternative. I think that they were just happy with the status quo, that we were an unorganized area under the guidance of the CRD. And I think that they were satisfied with that. At no time, I mean, there were always some who were not unhappy with the idea of joining with Colwood and Langford. And part of it, there were some long-term residents, I'm sure. In fact, I can think of a couple who really did want to join because they looked at their families and retirement and possibility of subdividing their property to give parcels to their children. And they saw that, you know, the attitude in Metchosin wasn't to do that. It was to keep land together. So there was a reason for some people to want to perhaps go a little more urban, but it was more often the kind of, I could think about Wally Meeks, nobody may know him, but down, who went to a lot of trouble trying to help his daughter get a lot here in Metchosin to subdivide, and it really was complicated.
So from the very beginning, people wanted Metchosin to stay rural.
They did.
With large lots.
Yeah, that was always about the lifestyle, you know. In fact, if you look over the years, there's been, well, I don't know. In our time, I can only remember one case of a rezoning. And I remember how it started so positive and ended so complicated, where we had 300 people come out to a meeting about the rezoning, and it was going to happen here, just over here at the community hall, right next to a fellow who had a company called Forest Technologies.
Yeah.
And Bill, I think, is still a longtime resident of the community. And he bought the house there and said, look, he'd like to move his business there. And what they did was they provided sensing equipment. Now, I don't recall all of it, but it senses things like lightning strikes and fires in the forests so that it can send a signal and people know about it. And at the time, you know, we looked upon it as high tech, you know, electronics, and we were all, I think every member of council initially thought this was just a great idea. But as the discussion went on, there were clearly a very much of a strong movement in the community that people were not happy with the idea of rezoning this piece of property. They had a whole variety of reasons, but I think the bottom line is that they just did not want to have commercial manufacturing being so close to the city center, and or at least the core here in Metchosin. And I can remember another meeting with 300 people on that rezoning when we were going to public hearing. and people were very, very vocal on it. And for a council, all 5 initially had been, I think, favorably disposed to the idea. By the time it came to the vote, 4 voted against it and 1 voted in favor of it. And you know, I mean, the job is to serve the people, but at the same time, you need to look at what the implications might be in the long run. Sometimes they're really tough decisions to make, but I think the council decided to go with, clearly, you don't get many people showing up at the council meetings, but when you get 300 showing up who are not very happy, some of them were in favor, don't misunderstand me, but the bulk were just not happy with the idea. And I think that was probably the most contentious, and it certainly made the council gun shy to even consider a rezoning application after that.
Yeah. So of the electorate then, how many were in? There was, I believe, a vote. How many were in favor of becoming a municipality, and how many wanted to stay?
Well, 65. I think the percentage who voted in favor, yes, was 65%. 35 were opposed. Said no, and that surprised a number of people. In the community, they were surprised it was that high.
And was it the possibility of being lumped in with Colwood and Langford, or?
Well, that was really the argument that was used throughout all the discussions of incorporation about the difference in attitude for lifestyle. Where it's not that one is better than the other. It's just Colwood and Langford are much more urban. And Metchosin is much more rural. I mean, they all have great lifestyles. Just it's a question of what people choose. And the majority of people in Metchosin, it didn't matter what your political strike was. In fact, we had a couple of developers who were very pro incorporation. That they could see the value in the long run. So I mean that's just
and what's extraordinary is that I mean, if you took the same vote today, it would be almost the same as it was back then.
Oh, I bet you it'd be higher today.
You think it would?
Yeah, I think that people really do appreciate the fact that it's very special, the lifestyle they have here. It's not without its difficulties, but I think everybody who was part of that movement and sees today, we're all very pleased that Metchosin really hasn't changed that much.
No.
I mean, there are some issues, but back then there were 2. I mean, bylaw infringement, I see, is an issue. That was an issue in our day, and was it in your day too, where we tried to solve it without going to court always, because we had actually. That's one thing I should mention that some people may not realize. The courts are not that sympathetic at times to municipal governments. I'll give an example. In 1981, Metchosin, Colwood, and Langford had a land use bylaw, a zoning bylaw. And somebody on Happy Valley Road, a gentleman by the name of Heinrich, in 81, took the CRD to court and said, this is not right. And he won. And threw the whole bylaw out. So which meant that Colwood, Langford, Metchosin had no land use bylaw. People could do what they wanted to do. And it took 6 months to get the bylaw back in place again, which of course created a lot of legal non-conforming properties that happened over that 6 months. And I know we saw it as well in other cases where municipal governments have a difficult time in the courts. Courts look much more rigorously at whether or not municipal standards should be applied quite the way that they have been. So I always say it's important to have bylaws, very important. But sometimes you got to weigh them out. Is that maybe there's another way you can solve the problem? Going to court doesn't always do it. High cost and maybe no win. Well,
it's extraordinary when you look at council today. It really is just almost very, very settled in the same following the same ideals that the early ones had. I mean, it was very interesting reading through something that I had not looked at before, and that came out. No. So let's hope we remain,
Oh, I can't see us changing unless a government decides that it's time to amalgamate municipalities. And, you know, there's still discussion of amalgamation of, first the four core and other areas. It's not as if it's sort of disappeared, that discussion. And ultimately, under current legislation, maybe not. But, you know, legislation can change. Depending on the government in power and the feeling of that day. And amalgamation can occur. And it's just a matter of people have to be vigilant and make sure that you know, they're maintaining at least, and I say vigilant, that they've got to be at least aware of what's happening and be sensitive if they think the government is moving. But at this point, all you read about it is in the paper. Fortunately, it doesn't seem to be the government. It's a group of residents who think amalgamation is a good idea in the four core area. But
when you look back on all the decisions you made before becoming, are there any changes you'd have made now? Or were you pretty happy with the way things went?
Well, it turned out okay in the end. But there is no doubt that we should have been more sensitive to the fact that we weren't getting transition grants. When the incorporation, the task force was talking about it, we should have been more cognizant of that. And because if we had not been able to encourage the government to give the grants, financially, it would have been very complicated for Metchosin. We would have had to, in fact, in our presentation, one of the suggestions we made to the minister is, if you're not going to give us the money, then we're going to be forced to present to the people to vote on borrowing the money. And if it's defeated, then maybe we can't be a municipality. I mean, literally, that's what we presented to them. And so all I can say is that if we could have done something differently, it worked out fine, but we should have done that in the task force. Should have really gone after the transition grants right away. And that we didn't find out after the fact that we had these extra costs and then not enough money to pay for them.
But on the other hand, you were sort of doing something that was essentially a new process that no other communities had taken part in anything similar.
Well, but Williams Lake had, Vanderhoof had.
Oh, they have. Okay.
Oh, yes, and Tumbler Ridge, all within 3 years prior to Metchosin had done that. And that's why I'm saying that the task force should have looked at and been a little bit more adamant about the transition grants.
Which they could have done with the province before.
We could have done, because I mean, Shirley Wild was very successful with the grants for the roads.
Yes.
But yeah, we could have. I think that part of the problem down deep was that people really wanted to incorporate because we were concerned about amalgamation. And maybe down deep, some of us felt we could get the grants afterwards, but I look back on it now that might not have been a great strategy. We lucked out.
I gather that one of the items that really upset people was the possibility that Colwood and Langford wanted to use Metchosin as a garbage dump.
I heard this. I heard this. I don't know if it was from you or somebody else, but I don't recall that to be true.
You don't? I don't recall. It's in this bits I've been reading a lot about it.
But I don't recall that.
Yeah.
I mean, there was always a lot of tension between. Unfortunately, I didn't like that it happened between Colwood and Metchosin and Langford. Yeah, we're different.
Yeah.
And even now, I note that with the development that I see going on in Colwood, especially in the gravel pit, they still are our neighbors, and we need to work together, to sort things out. And back then, when I was involved with council, there was some animosity that bothered me at times. You know, it's always better to get along with your neighbors.
Yeah,
It really is.
yeah,
But historically, there's been this
yes,
between and I look at Langford and Colwood, and I think what they're doing for the people, if that's what they want, it's just fine.
yeah, yeah. Well, oh, that's fascinating. Yeah,
It was. We quite enjoyed it. I want to say, though, that Herman Book was really a great person to have as the first
Yeah.
mayor.
yeah,
He was a very fine person to work with. He delegated well. And he was just really a nice person.
yeah,
And so we were very fortunate to have Herman, because
Yeah.
I think everything developed because of him.
yeah,
When we had disagreements on council, which councils will always have disagreement, he had a way of bringing people together.
mm,
And at the end of the meeting, there was never any animosity.
but he only served for 2 terms.
Yes, I thought it was 3 terms.
Was it?
I think it was 3,
Yeah,
because he and I became very good friends.
yeah,
I didn't know him beforehand,
Hmm.
because as you know, he was the fire chief. And I learned from the firemen that just how much they liked him and how much they respected him. This was before I ever met him.
mm,
And there was no doubt about it. You know, he was really a good choice for
Mm.
mayor. I'm sure Shirley would. She ran as well. She would have been a good mayor, but Herman was, because I worked with him,
mm,
I can say he was particularly good for
mm,
Metchosin.
Mm.
Yeah. I think he helped foster a
Mm.
lot of good feelings, and that's what you needed.
mm.
I mean, just as an example of the kind of person he was, Robin Hopper.
Mm.
Once, Robin Hopper had this big sign in the front for chosen pottery. Well, here's an example of bylaws. Well, he put it very close to the road. In fact, it was on the road allowance. And a couple of neighbors complained about it, and they wanted us to go after him and get him to move it. So Herman calls me, he says, I got my tractor, let's just go move it. And we did. And it was over. But that's the kind of person he was. You see, there's got to be an easy way to solve this problem.
Yeah,
So,
oh, that's lovely. Yeah.
so,
No, unfortunately, I never met him. We came back too late. Yeah,
yeah, well, it's just, and I have to say that the members of council by and large that I work with, the first group, they were all sort of like that, but Herman in particular.
yeah,
You know, he's being with the fire department, he just had this sort of
Yeah.
way about him. Yeah.
yeah. Well, we've now been going for quite a while. Maybe, do we have more to?
Well, I'll just answer your questions, or
Well, yeah, or if you want, we can open up the floor if anybody has questions or wants to share their own memories. And maybe while we're waiting, if you wanted to show some of those photos that you brought along.
Yes,
well, this picture, you brought this one.
yeah, I got this from council actually.
I don't know, can you see it?
Yeah, we can.
So
Maybe
that's the
just
first
yeah.
council. Going from your left, I guess, is Jeff Hadley, Noel Pemberton Billing, Bill Ritchie, who was a minister. Then there's Herman, and that's me, and then Bill Stevens. There you go.
Thank you.
I never saw that picture until today. Actually, it's a great picture.
Yeah. Do you have anyone there with questions?
I don't think we have, does any, oh, Jay wants to jump in. Do you have a question, Jay?
Yeah, hi, I can't see how to raise my hand, so I just want to throw myself out there. So Brian, thanks so much for your service to the community, and especially in the early days, and also you, Joe, as well. So Brian, thinking about like looking back and now looking ahead, and when you look at the early work you did, and you see Metchosin today, what are you proud of? What do you think you've helped sort of lay the foundation for? And is there anything that causes you worry and concern about the community right now, and particularly this whole concept and desire of keeping Metchosin rural? Thanks.
Well, it seems to me that the thing that I think that we all can be proud of at that time is that the raison d'etre for incorporating was to keep a lifestyle. And it seems to me that today we have the same lifestyle by and large. I mean, there are some exceptions. So I think that for all of us, that's been the benefit. And in terms of the future, well, that's a good question. I think that the thing that worries me, it's not a worry, but I don't know how it's going to play out, is how much federal land is in Metchosin and how that federal land might get used in the future. You have Albert Head, you have William Head, and then you have other federal holdings. We do want them. I mean, you do get wonderful grants in lieu of, which help finance the district. But I think that's one thing that causes me some concern. And the second one, of course, is the influence on the borderline of the growth of population of Colwood, especially at the gravel pit. I live in Albert Head, and I can see how that's already having an impact on parks such as Tower Point, on Whitty's Beach. So that's the second thing, I guess, that in terms of a concern that I have. Yeah.
Any other questions out there? Thank you, Jay.
I do have another one.
Oh, go ahead.
I'll let Marie-Therese go first if she has a question.
You're on mute, Marie-Therese.
Yeah, sorry. I'm Marie-Therese Little. I just wanted to say thanks to both of you for your service and your leadership in the past. At our last election in 2018, the most outstanding issue was by law enforcement, and it sounds like that has been an issue for a long time. And then secondarily, people were worried about amalgamation, and I heard on many doorsteps that we are one council away from development in Metchosin. And I'm just wondering how, if you were running, how you would tackle that. And I know we've got to keep to our OCP and our land use bylaws. I'm just wondering, based on your past experience and your thinking forward, how we can maintain our lifestyle, but maintain the rural character of Metchosin. Thanks.
Well, I haven't experienced that this thought that, so obviously you're meeting far more of people in Metchosin than I do, but I haven't heard this worry about that we're just one council away. I think that if anything I've heard is that maybe this is where you're getting it from, is that our land is becoming so expensive, is that we don't have a younger group coming. We're all tend to be seniors, and that movement might make people think that folks want to cut up the land. But I haven't heard that, so it's hard for me to respond since I haven't heard that. But in terms of your other point about what do we do, I think that the matter is that we continue to reinforce how lucky we are as terms of a lifestyle. I mean, we are very fortunate, and this is something that, if anything, a council can do is to continue to reinforce it. And of course, now you got social media, which we didn't have. Although that's a two-edged sword, I'm afraid. But I mean, I think it's council's responsibility to continue to reinforce the value of our lifestyle. And when you have elections, I mean, that's got to be a question, an issue that's got to be of paramount importance that all candidates respond to. And other than that, I'm not sure what else I could add.
Thanks very much.
I mean, we had people, by the way, who did want to develop Metchosin, very much so.
Yeah.
But they were far and few between. And although as I was suggesting earlier, with the price of land the way it's escalating, that's going to have major implications. There'll be more forces I have no doubt. It's just going to be a matter of some kind of sort of a concerted effort to try to maintain that. Although, anyway, I'll just leave it at that.
Okay.
Do you want to jump in again, Jay, with a question?
Sure. Thanks. So back to this word amalgamation. And it was earlier this year, I forget the time period, I think it was March or May or something, March, April, May, where there was a small news story that the CRD director in Isuk, and I forget his name all of a sudden, and Mayor John ran nation between Isuk and Metchosin. And I know this has come up in the past, and it was studied in some detail. I've actually got the studies myself, but any thoughts on that, Brian?
Well, Joe's husband, Frank, and I did a study with other people back in the 90s, 1998, 1999. And we went to Isuk, and we did this over a couple of months and looked at the possibility of bringing Isuk into Metchosin. And I haven't studied it since, so I don't have any new data, but it was not something we supported. There was similar on lifestyle, but to try to manage that, we just didn't see it working, and especially with the roads and the costs involved. If it made more sense for Isuk to either join Suk or go on their own, but we didn't think it made a lot of sense at the time to come that Metchosin should encourage that kind of a union. And as I said, I don't, and geographically, it's even a problem since it's separated with First Nations lands. And and now, of course, if you look at Isuk and look at its development at the end of the point there, it's really quite different. And land uses and attitudes about land use in Isuk, I think, are by and large quite different than that in Metchosin. So, no, I personally, I haven't changed my mind.
Jennifer, you have a question. Unmute yourself and go
I
ahead.
will unmute. Do you want to see me too? Hi, I should say hello to neighbors and thank you. This is really quite enjoyable. The beginnings of Metchosin, I think that actually my father-in-law was perhaps on that committee of 10 individuals who were sort of related to the Albert Head ratepayers. And he was also the manager of the gravel pit, and he would be quite distressed by what is happening in it at the moment. But my question is really around the fact, Brian, that you were essentially our finance person when you were elected. And you're sitting in a wonderful building that I think the community had to insist the municipality pay attention to the fact that it was up for sale, and finally they bought it. My bigger question would be around how you manage so well to just use reserves. And that is still, I think, the great principle of this municipality. And just wondered what you feel about, can we continue, to use reserves and hope that that's how we can keep our rural municipality? Or it's sort of question about reserves versus borrowing, I suppose. So wonder about your opinion on that. Thanks.
Well, back in 1985, 86, 87, we could get a pretty good interest rate. So if we had a couple of $1 million invested, maybe we could make 7.5%, 8% quite easily. So all of a sudden we'd make $160,000 in interest, keep half of the reserves, and the other half we could use to defer tax increases. And so that was sort of the philosophy. Today, the interest rate, you're going to have to start paying the bank to keep your money there rather than getting any interest. But the idea of using reserves, you need to keep reserves. You don't want to have shocks in the system. And it's all part of planning. And I even subscribe to, if it's necessary, to increase taxes to build reserves. so that you have control over the rated increase, so it's not a shock to people. But I very much believe that local government should use the idea of building up reserves to stop highs and lows and large changes in taxes. And taking over this building, well, this is a very nice building, but yeah, it's a very nice building, and I can see that it's performing a very important function. The thing that occurs to me is that maybe there's an opportunity, and I'm sure you've tried for a private-public partnership about trying to get some kind of source of revenue to try to pay for the maintenance costs, because this building, for those of us who happen to know a little bit about old houses, this place soaks up the money, I have to tell you.
Yeah, well, good point.
I believe that they have let out the other part of the school to an outside group, which is bringing in money.
That's great. Now,
I'm not 100% certain, but I think I'm correct in saying.
I know I had once, we talk about development, and it had always occurred to me that people who live in Metchosin can't really stay here once they become quite elderly unless they have help. But we don't have any options for them. Even back when we first started the council, this was something that we were asked about. What are you doing for people who have been here for 30 and 40 years and don't want to leave, have a property, they can't maintain it. And so now you own the school here, you have this property. And so is there a possibility of something for some kind of a seniors housing that could be here in the town center, where it would be an opportunity, at least there's something local that people could buy into, or maybe work with the Lutherans, Luther Court, for example. We did a lot of my company did a lot of work for their projects, looking for land. And it just seems to me, of anything, the value of owning now the school and the property, is there a possibility to have some kind of private-public partnership for a seniors group so that people could stay here in Metchosin, live here,
I was involved, through the Seniors Association, and this came up several times, this problem. And we did quite a bit of, we contacted a number of people to find out people's views on this. And there weren't that many people who were interested in finally retiring in Metchosin. They said, when the time comes, we'll go to a home. The other thing that was equally very upsetting is that we could not restrict any spaces we had to Metchosin people. That if any other Langford, Colwood, I'm sure they're very nice people, but on the other hand, they could equally come in here.
That was a problem we had too.
And deprive Metchosin people of coming in.
People had asked to restrict it, and of course you can't do that.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that still having that kind of a center in Metchosin is a good thing, I think, in any event.
Yes.
And the fact that when they come available, hopefully there are people in Metchosin who would like to stay here and buy it. And there are some who come from other areas and live here. Well, that's fine too. It seems to me that the two are not incompatible.
It hasn't been easy going through it.
No, I know we did.
You did.
I remember that quite, and that was a serious stumbling block. That people said, no, we want to restrict it.
Yeah.
But you can't do that because people have got to be able to sell it when they want to, and
But no.
Well, we're getting close to about an hour, so I just thought if there's anybody else who wants to ask a question before we wind down, now would be a good time to jump in. And I don't see any mics going off mute, so I think we'll bring it to a close. Thank you guys so much. What an interesting conversation it was.
Joe and Brian, thanks so much. I mean, Lori and I sat here and we laughed out loud a few times. We really enjoyed your conversation and your comments. And if anybody has ideas of other people you'd like us to interview, please let us know. And thanks so much, Joe and Brian.
Yeah. And we'd love to get your feedback in the chat. I put a link to our survey. And also I want to let you know next Thursday at 7 p.m. we have trivia, and we'd love for you to join us. There's other events we have if you go to our website, metchosinseniors.ca. And with that, thank you so much, Joe and Brian. It's been just a real delight and pleasure.
Well, thank you for asking me. That was good fun. Yeah.
Thank you very